Good morning, good evening, everyone. It's midnight in Japan, and I'm sitting in Tokyo office. My name is Joseph, and I work at Asian Research Institute for International Social Work at Shukutoku University, Japan. And this is the third session of the International Academic Forum. And I'm really happy to welcome our guests from North America. And I would like to provide some technical information to our participants. So your microphones and cameras are off right now and should stay off for the entire session. If you have any technical problem, please wait a second. If you have any technical problem, cannot hear the voice or cannot see the PowerPoint slide, anything, please let us know using the chat window or Q&A. You find your Q&A on the bottom of your Zoom screen. During the session, we would be very happy to get some feedback and also some comments and questions from you. So the same, please use Q&A or chat window and let us know. Just one click, send a message, and we will share your comments and questions. So that's all from me, and I would like to pass the button to Edward Kanda, who will be moderator of the North American session. Edward, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Joseph. Welcome to everyone to this session on Indigenous social work education and practice in North America. My name is Edward Kanda. I'm a professor emeritus at the University of Kansas. I'm going to be moderating, and I'm also the third presenter. So I'm really happy to participate with my fellow presenters in this wonderful event, and I thank the Asian Research Institute for International Social Work, and particularly Joseph for all the wonderful help and for making this great occasion possible. For our session, we're going to have three presenters. The first is Michael Yellowbird, Professor and Dean of the University of Manitoba Faculty of Social Work. He will be presenting about mindfulness and neurodecolonization. The second is by Professor Nicole Ives, who's also director of the Bachelor of Social Work program at McGill University School of Social Work. She'll be presenting on developing Indigenous-centered social work education. And then I will be presenting on culturally and ethically appropriate use of Buddhist-derived mindfulness practices in professional social work. So our format is each of us will have 30 minutes to present and include a brief time of questions and answers for us individually. And then at the end, after my presentation, with the time remaining, hopefully about 20 minutes, we'll continue to have an open question discussion session that can be connecting all three of us with the audience. So with that, again, thank you for joining us. And I'd like to turn it over to my good friend, Dean Yellowbird.
Thank you, Edward. Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be here this morning to present some of the work that I do. And so I want to just go ahead and jump right into it right away so I can, so we can manage our time, so I can manage the time that I have. Okay, so let's, if you could bring up the first slide, Joseph.
Sure. Wait a minute.
And as Joseph is bringing it up, I just want to say I'm coming to you from Canada, from Manitoba, Canada, from the Treaty 1 territory, the homelands, traditional homelands of the Dakota people, as well as the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Ojai Cree, the Dene people, and also the current homelands of the Métis people. So I just want to make that acknowledgement that I'm on someone else's territory, which is one of the things that we do here in North America. So moving on to my first slide here, I want to be talking this morning about, I didn't put it in the title, but spirits in the genes and neurodecolonization and mindfulness and the medicine wheel, and how I think Indigenous social work can be captured in this very important symbol that we have. So let's go to the next slide, please. The goals today is I just really want to kind of introduce folks to the, if you haven't heard of the medicine wheel and these different quadrants and how they're critical to helping us decolonize ourselves, our communities, and guide us towards, you know, personal and community social justice. Also, this talk, which is a much longer talk, it's cooked down. I talk a lot about our ancestors, our Indigenous ancestors, and how their worldviews were very correct for us and how we lived our lives, and they practiced healing and created community. And how today living like a Westerner for almost anyone, you know, is very hazardous to our health. And that includes, you know, how we practice social work. So I want to share some terms in neuroscience and microbial science and genetic science, and how those are related to mindful decolonization, as I say. Let's go on to the next slide, please. So what I talk a lot about in my research today is not only decolonization, but how we decolonize by decolonizing the mind and the body. And so neurodecolonization is a term that I created, kind of a conceptual framework where I think about how colonialism, the impact it's had on Indigenous people around the world, not just in North America, but it's also created different layers of trauma. And it's affected how the brain's structure and function, gene expression, the immune system, and the diversity of our gut biome has changed after being colonized, and has major implications for us in social work. You know, we generally talk about holistic practice, but we don't get into the, you know, how our genes, you know, need to be expressed, how our immune system functions, particularly now in the age of COVID, where we're seeing a lot of Indigenous people pass because of COVID infections, you know, and I think we know now why that's happening. Okay, so next slide, please. So neurodecolonization is this: what happens to the brain and the body in a colonial context? How does it fare? And how engaging these traditional Indigenous mindfulness practices can really help decolonize and heal the body from colonialism. And decolonization, just for all intents and purposes, are any activities that weaken the effects of colonialism, facilitate, you know, practices that are helpful to us in present day settings, and to think about traditional practices. These are my two of my oldest daughters here when they were littler, practicing mindfulness. So, and the beginning slide was my oldest daughter. So if you want to advance it four times, Joseph, this is the medicine wheel. Go ahead and advance it 4 times. Next slide, say that. Next slide, there you go. 2 more times, okay. So this is what okay, now you've got to back up 1. Okay, all right. So this is what the medicine wheel looks like. You know, that's the 4 quadrants, that holistic, which is the mind, body, spirit, and emotional. And it varies from different tribes in North America. But what I've done with this medicine wheel is in terms of neurodecolonization, is tried to put together things from Western science and knowledge, along with Indigenous science and knowledge, to come up with how we can, you know, develop a model and practice with Indigenous populations. So in the first part, you'll see the neuroplasticity and neurogenesis of the mind. We know that from the decade of the brain. We know now that in the quadrant just below that, the yellow quadrant, which is the human microbiome, we have a new sort of life that, you know, the new life that lives within us, right? So, and then on the spiritual side, then we have these practices that we do as Indigenous people that are contemplative. And finally, on the other, don't go advance yet. We have genetic inheritance and epigenetics that and these molecular structures that have been colonized by you know, colonialism. So when you look at I know you can't see it, but On the right side, it says our culture, experiences, and perceptions. All these things, our cells, our genes, everything that we have been through have affect our plasticity, and how we express. And when you go on to the top left side, how do we heal and transform from the diseases of colonization? And I am saying that we rediscover ancestral knowledge and practices, because these are things that we now contained. We know this, they're now contained in our epigenetic profile. And when we do these things, when we correct the way our brain works and our body, like the new great circle of life is what I call the human microbiome, and we engage in our indigenous mindfulness practices, then we can return to a balance, right? And there are these different kinds of things I'll talk about in just a minute. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to talk about colonization, but my model of decolonization, it always changes. Otherwise, it's generally usually colorful here. But decolonization is this idea that, there's a cleansing period that happens, that when we become mindful and conscientious of, what's happened to us, that we begin to strip away these harmful thoughts and practices. And then we go into the next period, which is the Renaissance, the restoration of our cultural practices and the ideas and beliefs that we had. And then we move into the final stage now, kind of where we're at now, the Enlightenment period, where we bring together Western ideas, Eastern ideas, indigenous ideas, ideas from all of our people, whoever we are, and we kind of bring those together to contribute to the advancement and the empowerment of indigenous people. So that's what decolonization is. It's these kind of, at least in the way I look at it, these three phases. Next slide. So we can be colonized at a very, very deep level. We don't think about that much as social workers, right? We think about people, don't get their needs met, but we understand now from looking at molecular science that trauma can also colonize the mind and the body. Next slide, please. And it colonizes really important parts of our body, right? In this particular slide, you're seeing what are called dendritic spines that are in the prefrontal cortex of the brain. It's very important. This is the language we should all know as social workers. We should have an understanding of how what I call enzymatic colonization happens, how the different kinds of enzymes and proteins and the different messages that we get, from stress and colonization then begin to change really fundamental things in our body. And this happens in the front of our brain, where this protein kinase C floods our prefrontal cortex and begins to break down these dendritic spines, which are so important for our sensory perception, our movement, our memory, those kinds of things. So when we see populations that have been colonized and they have this chronic sort of oppression that occurs, then, we can think, okay, we get them food, we get them shelter, then they're okay. But, we haven't taken care of the threats. And so internally, these things are still happening. You're still seeing a major sort of breakdown in these dendritic spines that are associated with memory and learning. And there are gender differences, if you see on the left side, where acute responses can decrease more spines, which are, which take the information that we need to the brain to help us survive, from women, and men actually grow more. We know now that with indigenous people around the world, the neurodegenerative diseases are higher, much higher than the general population. And of course, one of the reasons is that people theorize is that the dendritic spines that are affected by colonization and chronic stress are breaking down. But as you see at the very bottom there, which makes us more vulnerable to things like Alzheimer's and dementias. See at the bottom there, they can repair when their stress is eliminated and we go back to practicing, our traditional ways. Next slide, please. So also at the end of our chromosomes are telomeres. And we know this from basic science. Those of us who've taken basic biology, we know about chromosomes. But we know a bit more now about what happens, when we're under stress, and what the reason that telomeres are at the ends of the chromosomes, which keep them from mutating and deteriorating, fusing with other chromosomes. Next, please. And telomeres protect our genetic data, help us live longer, make sure we're healthy, and prevent cancer. Right? Tells us how we're going to get cancer. Next, please. We know that every time as we naturally age, even without stress, our telomeres get shorter because our cells divide. And then When they get too short, the cells can no longer divide, then the cells actually begin to die. When you see healthy older populations that have not been disturbed by colonization, you'll see that they look very, they've got good memories, they live a long time, they're happy. And it's because they are still practicing their traditional ways of eating traditional foods, traditional relationships. They're involved in prayer, and they're involved in their ceremony. They're involved in a lot of activity, those kinds of things. So they don't get cells that are senescent or die, and their telomeres are longer. So this is what's happened with indigenous people around the world, is that colonization has then began to affect them at this molecular level around the telomere. Next slide, please. So this is just a few studies. This study shows that middle-aged people who are physically active and had these higher aerobic capacities, also had longer telomeres than people who were sedentary, right? And they had telomeres that were similar to those who were younger than they were. So all of us who are listening from this, from countries that are becoming industrialized, you can compare yourself with the people that are rural people that don't have the stress. Probably, same age-wise, we're going to have shorter telomeres because we live in a Western society that has all the stressors and chronic, diseases and illnesses. So next slide, please. So again, this is the power of chronic stress, though, and think about it. I think about it as indigenous people. The telomere lengths, which are, they should be long, get short, right? For people who are depressed and healthy. Think about that. People that go out and exercise. So if you go out and you run for an hour or whatever, that's not enough, right? If you're showing chronic stress, those telomeres are still going to get shorter. You're going to get the diseases of aging earlier. And of course, depressed people exhibit these additional things like cortisol dysregulation, where fight-flight kinds of neurochemistry are there. And of course, then they have higher probability of having shorter telomere lengths. So they've got two things going against them. So when we do an assessment of people, we never think about these kinds of things in social work. We just think, well, have you had enough to eat? Have you, gotten your services, those kinds of things. But I'm talking about colonization at the molecular level that we are now just beginning to understand and should be brought into social work. Next slide, please. So next slide, please. So we know that it also affects children at a very early age, right? Stressful homes, environments also shorten our telomeres. And in this particular study here, which is dated now, but again, it's been replicated. Children living in stressful home environments have shorter telomeres than kids that are living in nurturing environments. So when I think about indigenous people in social work practice, this is what we're dealing with. We're, even though we may get the child and we may move them from one foster home placement to another, or they may go home and they're still going to be stressed there. Those telomeres are getting shorter, and what we're doing is putting those children at risk of getting the diseases of aging earlier. So when governments and when colonizing and settler systems and control do not provide services for these kids, it's happening at the molecular level. We're not going to see it in the next year or 5 or 10 years. We're going to see it maybe 20 years down the road, where kids are going to have all these illnesses and diseases, what we're seeing, and shorter life expectancy. So we have to understand as social workers that this is happening at the molecular level. Next slide, please. We also know that mothers who are stressed out, and this happens with a lot of indigenous people around the world because they've moved off their traditional diets. Their diets have been colonized, their movement has been colonized, so they don't move or run like they used to. And of course, the stress that they have also get shorter telomeres. They pass those on. This is Elizabeth Blackburn's work, she's won the Nobel Prize studying telomeres, says that, of course, mothers can pass that on, shorter telomeres, to unborn children. So those kids that are coming out of these chronic situations are already coming out, behind they're not even at the starting line. They're way back of the starting line, right? And this is a problem. And this is why, again, social workers need to consider diet and movement as very, very important parts of our practice. Next slide, please. Not only with indigenous people, with all people. Something else that happens to the brain is that this BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is something that's very important. We have to have it in our brain. when we exercise, when we laugh, when we do things that, you know, make us feel better, it raises the level of brain-derived neurotrophic factor in the brain. And that's important because it creates new brain cells and it protects our existing brain cells. Right? Next slide, please. Advance it 2 more, 3 more, I think. 1, 2, okay, that's good there. We know that from this study that when you put people under chronic stress and colonization, it raises the BDNF in their brain, which is good because, as you remember now, BDNF protects the brain, makes you grow more brain cells. That's a good thing. That happens when you run. It happens when you swim, when you exercise, and so on. But when they're activated for too long, the genes kick in the front part of the brain that produce these higher levels of social anxiety, withdrawal, and depression. And so when that happens, and you've got people that are under siege, economically, socially, politically, culturally, then we know that this mediated signaling that's happening with this high rise of BDNF and the activation of these particular genes that increase a level of depression and suicidal behavior. Not surprisingly, you see among Indigenous people the highest levels of depression and very, very high levels of suicidal behavior. So we know that even though if you take away, you know, some of these threats, that brain has to come back into balance, and so does the genetic expression, right? Next slide, please. So how do we decolonize the mind, right? So let's go ahead and move on to, I say, traditional healing practices. So let's go to the next slide, please. So these are 12 mindfulness practices that can heal our emotions, reset our genetic expression, facilitate improved learning. I call it the old, new Indigenous social work, because as you look at that, we don't do this in our practice. We don't say, how many times have you run this week? That's my assessment. How many times have you danced this week? How many times have you been singing this week? You know, we were meant to move, dance, and sing. This comes from an evolutionary biological framework that we know that this is what all people have done. Run, dance, and they were singers. And sleep is so important. We don't think about sleep. You know, we should be doing assessments on sleep. Same thing with laughter and humor. There's a science behind that. We don't ask people, how many times have you laughed and told jokes, right? How have you been around your tribe this week? Have you been around your people? Have you fasted? Now, these are all things that, you know, I found in the literature that Indigenous people have done. Meditation and adaptive stress, mild bioenergetic stress, like sitting in really hot saunas or really hot sweat lodges or sitting in really cold pools of water, produce something called heat shock proteins that, of course, increase longevity and raise our brain-derived neurotrophic factors and so on. Of course, being outside. Next slide, please. So when we look at that, we'll say, well, there's really major effects on our wellness, right? When people run and they move. So I call it movement deficit disorder that we're suffering from now, or colonized movement, right? We know that we've evolved to run, that our brain does better when we run, the executive function. And of course, there you see on bullet point number 4, the brain-derived neurotrophic factor, the miracle grown, as it's called, for the brain goes up. And finally, the last bullet point shows that regular endurance exercise causes these adaptations. And this is all people around the world used to run down their food and walk long distances to get water. As an industrialized society, we take all kinds of pills for that now because we don't do that, right? But it shows these adaptations in what's called kynurenine metabolism that protects us from depression by increasing the skeletal muscle CAT, C-A-T, kynurenine aminotransferase, right? So these are things that are just important for us in our lexicon and social work. So because as the word depression is, because we know that when the increase of skeletal muscles from movement is happening, it shifts away from this neurotoxic kynurenine, right? And produces this other acid, KYNA. So this is why this is nothing short of a miracle for us, how we can improve depression around the world. And I say in particular for Indigenous people, since we're closer to our hunter-gatherer, we weren't farming communities for long periods of time. And even when we weren't farming communities as long as the Europeans or other people were. Next slide, please. Dancing, very important. We know from this pretty recent research is that endocannabinoids, which are, these biochemical messengers, signal messengers that improve our mood, reduce our stress and anxiety, enhance our memory. And again, look at that at the very bottom, protect our brain. These are things that we have all done, but more recently, indigenous people did, right? So we know that these are protective factors. When people dance, their levels of endocannabinoids go up. When they cycle or when they walk and they run, endocannabinoid levels go up, protecting their brain, decreasing depression and so on. But we know in this particular study, if you look at the second paragraph, the most beneficial activity was singing. And when you look at the early times when settlers were coming among indigenous people, they remarked how often they were dancing and celebrating and singing. Now we know that, and of course, those things were banned, right? So we know why they were doing that, right? Now, raising their level of moods, protecting themselves. Next slide, please. Humor, very important. This is my Uncle Curly here. And we know that laughing also increases brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Improves memory and learning, lowers cortisol, relaxes blood vessels, boosts T cells, very important in the age of COVID, and releases endorphins. But this particular research shows that laughing and humor gets down to the DNA differences in this particular gene called 5-HTT-LPR, the serotonin transporter gene. People with that gene, I'm one of those indigenous people that have this funny bone gene, love to laugh, love to joke, And when we were on, it's just part of who I am, and that's the community I grew up in. So when you think about this, and we know that this frequency is more, this gene is more found frequently in collectivist cultures, that people with short alleles who have this gene flourish in a positive environment where there's a lot of laughter, a lot of teasing, a lot of joking, a lot of smiling, a lot of funny storytelling. But when you take them and you put them into a colonized society that doesn't value humor and laughter, and everything is serious, they're going to suffer. And this is what happened to kids in residential school in Canada and the United States, moved from their communities and put into these very serious situations. And of course, chronic stress keeps us in that serious situation. So again, another thing that makes us vulnerable. And it's Joan Chiao's work. She's a neuroscientist, I think at the University of Chicago, found that collectivist cultures like indigenous cultures, African cultures, all these collectivist cultures, more likely to comprise people who carry this short allele, the funny bone gene, I call it, in all these 29 nations. And not surprisingly, when you start looking at these nations, as the people get less and less funny as you get to around Europe, like Western European countries. Next slide, please. Effects on sleep. This is my res dog at rest here. He's kind of taking a break. And we know that another thing that's colonized our sleep is industrial society. This is something that's made us ill. And as indigenous people, it's really disrupted our sleep. And we know it's crucial for childhood development. We know this is when growth hormones are happening in our bodies that give us, the muscle and keep our bones strong, and infection-fighting proteins are released. And of course, here it is again. Poor sleep affects our memory, and language is difficult to learn. One of the things we know now from neuroscience is that when we sleep at night, we get these neurochemicals that come through our brain, and they wash our brains out and wash away things like amyloid proteins, which are the hallmark of Alzheimer's disease. They wash them out, they're taken out through our own lymphatic system, and we pee them out later in the day or whatever. We don't sleep well. All of us are at risk, and this is why we're seeing Alzheimer's rise around the world. It's not just among indigenous people, it's rising around the world for those of us who are, carry cell phones and are distracted and not sleeping well. Next slide, please. So let's go beyond this one. Next slide, please. Don't have enough time to go through all these slides. Next slide, please. This is what I was talking about earlier. When indigenous people go back to their roots, whether they're sitting in really hot or cold climates and they expose themselves to these temperatures, because it gives them a feeling of warmth later and a feeling of good, they feel well later. One of the things that's happening in their bodies, in their cells, are these proteins called heat shock proteins. So when you sit in this place and you push yourself through that, they call that mild bioenergetic stress. And these are rites of passages that young people and old people did with indigenous people. Most of us don't do that anymore unless you're kind of well-to-do and you can go to the gym, before COVID and sit in the sauna, right? But indigenous people had this around the world where they would put themselves in cold water and they would, kind of do this as rituals, mindful rituals, or sit in hot environments as mindful rituals and pray and those kinds of things. Now we know from the molecular science what was happening in their bodies was that they were building up heat shock proteins, higher levels, which then, of course, are a sign of longevity, disease protection, healthy skeletal muscles, and of course, brain health, right? Let's go next slide, please. Fasting, we know, is something that was very important, and we know that people did that. Next slide, please. And we evolved to fast, and this is why when I look at indigenous people, I see such a, not through any fault of their own, they're colonized diets, and through Western, taking away land, taking away their growing, knowledge and those kinds of things. But we know that there were periods where they went, when they didn't eat. We think that's a bad thing today, but we actually evolved to, to be able to go periods without eating, and it made us more resilient and stronger. So this is a missionary, Paul Lejeune, who was in 1636 among some these Montagnais Indian hunter-gatherers in Canada, talking from his journal about, how he saw them, and as a Westerner, a colonizer, a settler coming in, seeing these indigenous people suffer, because they hadn't eaten, but they were still cheerful doing their work. And they told him, of course, we're 2 or 3 days, sometimes more, without eating, and you have to take courage. And they're telling this priest this, take courage, let your soul be strong to endure suffering and hardship, keep yourself from being sad, otherwise the belt will be sick, right? And this is, we're talking then again about the humor and about the laughter that these indigenous people had, even in hardships, right? That they could, see how, we do not cease to laugh, even though we have little to eat. Today, we understand that not, as a cultural or a social kind of thing, but we understand it as the genetic thing, how they were able to do that and how they evolved to laugh at hardship, right? So if you've heard the term historical trauma, sometimes we have to get back to historical trauma and understand it from that level, that we can't spend too much time, kind of wallowing, in the pain of the past, because our ancestors didn't do that. That's kind of novel for us to kind of talk about that for such a long time and not create a ceremony to get over it and move on. Next slide, please. So there's all these benefits about fasting, of course, but I want to draw your attention to number 5. Again, protecting the brain, against all these diseases. And of course, the last bullet point, Mark Mattson, who is a big-time neuroscientist in the States, now he's retired from his job at Johns Hopkins, but he did all these studies and found out that, when we do fast, it imposes a challenge to our cells, and those cells respond adaptively by enhancing their ability to cope and resist stress and disease. So when people were going like they do, and they ritually fast, like indigenous people used to do, they of course were improving their health, and their ability to cope with stress and resist disease. Now we live in a society of Western society where we have ad libitum eating. We can eat anytime we want. Open that fridge and and drink sweet drinks and sugary drinks and eat all these refined foods. And of course, it's been really hard on our brains and our bodies and our genes and that kind of thing. Next slide, please.
Michael, we got about 7 minutes till Nicole.
Okay. So this is last thing. They call it now the miracle drug outside, being outside, which is interesting because now this Richard Louv calls it nature deficit disorder, because everybody's been pulled inside. We're all inside doing this kind of thing, right? But again, this is again something fundamental to indigenous people, that it's not a new miracle drug. It's something that we did living on the land and being part of the land. And there are all these problems, that of course that are linked to this epidemic of activity, right? And the devaluing of independent play. We don't play anymore. And again, this is what social work should be doing, is encouraging people to play, all these kinds of things. Okay, let's move to the next slide. So this, I think this may be getting close to my last slide. All these things I've been talking about, when people talk a lot about resilience, but most of us in social work don't talk about resilience in terms of cognitive resilience, how our brain can cope with stress, right? And everything I've talked about, sitting in hot saunas or cold ice pools or fasting, running, moving, singing, sleeping well, those kinds of things, all those 12 things that I mentioned are ways of building cognitive resilience. So if you see on the left side, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex is activated. Now we know from brain imaging, this is where resilience lives. The right side, we see risky coping. And we know from the second bullet point here, Indigenous people probably had very high resilient coping mechanisms because many of us were given this training prior to colonization to deal with high levels of stress and uncertainty, like whether or not you were going to get food, when you had to run, when you had to, sit in these situations that made you very uncomfortable. But we know that improves cognitive resilience. Next slide, please. So resilient coping then, if you look at the bottom here, is that located in the prefrontal cortex and the mammalian brain, the frontal lobe, kind of under the cerebral hemispheres. It's implicated in the processing of risk and fear, right? How do I manage my risk and fear about a situation? How do I inhibit the emotional responses when I'm overwhelmed? How can I improve my decision-making and self-control when I'm in these risky situations? And finally, what's happened here is that when I was a professor at Humboldt State University, living in Yurok territory and Wiyot territory and Hoopa territory, I got a chance to meet all of the many of the elders and the scholars, and they talked about these particular kinds of things that their young people went through a few hundred years ago, and it was well documented that they would swim out in the open ocean where there were great white sharks and come back, and now that's talk about risky, right? That was part of their rituals. Of course, they sang their prayer songs as they swam. And then they ran into the mountains. And if you're in Northern California, it's a very cool climate. And the mountains, it gets cold. So you run up in the mountains without, clothing, just your bare feet or your moccasins and a cedar vest and a skirt, So your body's exposed to the cold. So these are all the things they were doing. And of course, running on the mountain trails, you had grizzly bears and mountain lions, but of course you had mountain spirits. So they're processing their risk and fear, and they did it over and over and over again. And of course, we knew that, now as they did that, their resilient coping was being activated, and they were building neuronal cells in that were going to keep them resilient against disease and illness and stress and starvation. So I'm going to stop at this slide here. So colonization has come and robbed Indigenous people of all these old practices. And we'll say to the social workers, think about how we can move people back into those places. Forget about some of that Western stuff you're learning. Think about how Indigenous practices create this resiliency. And I think that's why I call it the new and the old social work practice, because this is old stuff. Now we're saying, well, just because Western science is saying, well, we can see this in a brain image, or we can see it under a microscope or a molecular electronic scope, or microscope, we can see these things happening in the blood. We know that these are things that Indigenous people and all people have done for, actually hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years, and that we have these genetic blueprints and profiles in our body that are going to protect us if we're able to take social work and help people remember their culture and return back to those kinds of practices. So I'm going to end here and just say thank you to everyone.
Thanks very much, Michael. Let's take one question, and then we can have more discussion at the end of the three of us. So could we have one question for Michael? Joseph, could you relay a question for Michael?
Actually, we got no questions.
All right. Well, how about if let's wait till the end of, and we can have more discussion with Michael.
Yeah.
So Nicole, it's a pleasure to have you with us. So I'd like to turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I'm just going to share. Thank you very much, Dean Yellowbird and Professor Kanda. I'm very thankful to be a part of this group. I learned so much from Dean Yellowbird's presentation, and I have to figure out now how to incorporate it into the work that I'll be doing with Inuit. I would like to just also say thank you to Professor Akimoto and Shukutoku University and ARIISW for organizing this conference and helping us to share what we're learning together. So what I want to do in this 30 minutes that I have is talk about how to create Indigenous-centered education and social work, particularly in colonized spaces. I want to start by asking who we are in this work, because as an ally, as a non-Indigenous person, asking this question, reflecting on this question is very important in terms of how we go about our work. And one of the things that we do is think about our positionality. Takats has defined positionality as multiple and unique experiences that situate each of us in relation to each other. And it's critical for social workers to position themselves, whether they're working with Indigenous or non-Indigenous peoples. And this has been articulated by Indigenous scholars and elders as well. So as Absalon writes, we speak from our location and announce who we are, where we come from, and what our intentions are. And in doing so, we are announcing who we are not and where we do not speak from. So when we share who we are, we're also paying attention and caring for our relationships with others, which I believe is the foundation of social work, the foundation of collaborative work. And this also speaks to the long-term nature of our work, which is relationship building, commitment to each other, staying in the long term. So I'm going to talk about these elements of allyship. So I wanted to start with a bit of history. And this also is important because it has an impact, as Dean Yellowbird was talking about in his presentation. It has an impact on the present day. So I wanted to just briefly tell you that I moved to Canada from the United States with my family in 2006. And in the US, I was intimately aware of racism and discrimination against Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. But I had limited knowledge of racism and oppression in Canada. Like many Americans, I believed that nearly everything was simply better in Canada, such as universal health care, reasonable costs for post-secondary school, and of course, hockey. I remember my first visit to Nunavik. I was there to promote social work education. And when I asked a group of high school students what they thought of when they said social work, one student raised her hand and said very seriously, "Run for your life." So relationships between social workers and Indigenous peoples in Canada have been seriously damaged because of colonial efforts of the government, and social workers have participated in these efforts. One of the more insidious directives by the Canadian government, something that Michael Yellowbird had also described, was the residential school system. The goal of residential schools was to eliminate Indigenous cultures through violent assimilation of children. So this went on, that it started in the 1870s, and the last residential school didn't close until 1996. So based on this harmful experiences of generations of Indigenous peoples, how do social workers try to repair these relationships? So Baskin notes that non-Indigenous social workers, academics, and other allies are discussing their roles in the past and present social problems of Indigenous peoples in Canada. and how they can participate in decolonization processes. Again, it's through forging these relationships. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada is a purpose, the purpose was to engage the public in purposeful remembering in order to promote healing, forgiveness, and reparation, and restore dignity of victims and communities for those who had been affected, who had attended residential school and whose families had attended residential school. In Canada, the implementation of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement began in 2007. And an important part of the agreement was the founding of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada to reveal truth about the residential school system and facilitate methods of reconciliation among former students, their families, and communities, as well as all Canadians. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission had important calls to action, particularly with regard to Indigenous child welfare, education, and reconciliation. And they defined reconciliation as the ongoing process of establishing and maintaining respectful relationships. A critical part of this process involves repairing damaged trust by making apologies, providing individual and collective reparations, and following through with concrete actions that demonstrate real societal change. So for many non-Indigenous Canadians, there was an acknowledgement that they were not aware of the injustices, the violent assimilation that was occurring in residential schools. We don't know what we don't know. But however, now that we know it, we need to do something about it. There were many calls to action that in the School of Social Work that we looked at and tried to figure out, okay, what are the concrete actions? What are the concrete actions that we can take? So for McGill School of Social Work and our path to reconciliation, one of the things that we did was create Indigenous Access in McGill. I'm going to talk very briefly about these three major pieces of our reconciliation path and to demonstrate how the embarking on this path brought us to where we are today. And I'll bring us back to my first trip to Nunavik. So I wanted to highlight that residential schools affected First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities as well. And so Indigenous Access McGill was started in 2007 as a support for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis students in the School of Social Work. The picture there is one of my colleagues who co-founded Indigenous Access McGill, Michael Loft, as well as one of our first graduates, Valerie Jacobs, who came back to school as a grandmother and finished her Bachelor of Social Work degree. The main activities were collaborating with Indigenous communities, recruitment, and social support and curriculum development. Another aspect of our path, and this grew out of Indigenous Access McGill, was this piece of curriculum development. It was through relationship that we had the motivation to create this type of field course. We were looking at in 2008, 2009, indigenizing our curriculum. And we brought scholars from Nicola Valley Institute of Technology, Gord Briere and Michelle Reed, to talk to us about our curriculum and help us see what aspects of the curriculum that we could modify, alter, change. when they were talking about their curriculum, they were talking about their, what they called a culture camp. And it was for their Indigenous Bachelor of Social Work program. All students had to participate in this culture camp before starting their program. And then they invited myself and my colleague, Courtney Montour, from the Ganankahaga or Mohawk community of Ganawage to participate. We gladly went, and we lived on the land for a week with this course. We wanted to bring it back to McGill. Of course, we adapted it to the Ganankahaga Mohawk context, but this was an important step for us. Initially, it was a pilot study, and we got a lot of resistance. Speaking of trying to create, integrate Indigenous curriculum into a westernized model of learning, we got criticism. We had people chiding us. There was teasing, actually, in terms of the components. But we ignored all that. And I'm thankful that we just celebrated our 10th anniversary of the field course, and it's now a permanent aspect of our social work curriculum. As Dean Yellowbird noted, the physical, emotional, and intellectual and spiritual elements of this course are equally important. We have elders with us, and facilitators, knowledge keepers from Ganawage, Mohawk territory, and that is where our focus is. It's interdisciplinary because from our perspective, social work is about building relationships, and so we want to engage law, medicine, anthropology, education, and other disciplines to learn from Indigenous peoples about working with Indigenous peoples. So that is where we got to. Flashback to last year, we were offered to be part of a team. I'm part of a team, and we were invited to submit a proposal for a Bachelor of Social Work program that would be delivered in Nunavik. We were invited by the Nunavik Health and Regional Board of Health and Social Services. And it was, for me, it was a dream come true. I felt that all those years after I was shown by a young Inuk student, my naivete about coming into Nunavik with my very enthusiastic perspective of social work, the path that I needed to take, that the journey that I needed to go through, my own process of decolonization, to be able to come to this point to work on creating a proposal to deliver a Bachelor of Social Work. So I'm very thankful. I am part of an incredible team that includes Professor Wanda Gabriel, who is the Director of Indigenous Access McGill, and also part of the School of Social Work, Pamela Waitman from the School of Social Work, and Professor Carmen Cecilia from the School of Continuing Studies. It was the four of us who put together this proposal in a very short time frame, but we were driven by a passion to participate in the decolonization of Nunavik. As a little background, there are 14 communities, as you see on the slide here. In Nunavik, there are 2 Inuit social workers, 2 Inuit who hold a Bachelor of Social Work degree for all these 14 communities. So all social workers in these communities, aside from these 2, are from the South, are non-Indigenous from the South, and primarily non-Indigenous from the South, and non-Inuit, more importantly. And so colonialism is alive and well in Nunavik. And so it's been part of my passion, part of what I feel has driven me to try to right that wrong. So in creating this Bachelor of Social Work, the Health Board approached us, and we knew right away that we needed to create an Inuit advisory committee where the majority of participants were Inuit, build on our current relationships and consultation with local partners. I have done research in Nunavik. Professor Gabriel has done clinical work with partners in Nunavik, and Professor Cecilia has also participated in partnership in delivering certificate programs in Inuit management. So we knew that we would be relying on our relationships and consulting with our local partners, as well as tailoring courses for Inuit, particularly highlighting cultural, social, economic, and spiritual realities. That doesn't mean that we didn't have significant challenges, which I will continue to talk about. So in order to indigenize the BSW program, what does that mean? We knew that it could not be simply importing the BSW that we currently offer in the South. As much as we are trying to indigenize our BSW program that we deliver in Montreal, this had to be important for Inuit who wanted to stay in their communities, wanted to stay, work, live in their communities while they were being engaged in education, just like many non-Indigenous do in Southern contexts. So we need to identify Inuit knowledge holders to guide course tailoring and co-instruct. We dreamed big for this proposal because we wanted to do it right. We want all courses except Inuktitut, which is included in the curriculum. So students will get credit for speaking their first language, Inuktitut. We wanted them to be co-instructed by an Inuit and either Indigenous or non-Indigenous instructor. So there will be significant hiring for this. And it's very exciting for us to be able to post for Inuit instructors who will be basically at the same level as professors coming from the South who may co-teach some of the classes. Another very important point is to adopt a learner-centered approach. Oftentimes within Western academic spaces, there may be lip service to a learner-centered approach, but we don't often see it. So what we mean is that we will seek to design complex activities that engage learners and facilitate that engagement with course content. It means providing varying learning environments, fostering collaborative work, creating challenging environments, and supporting learners by providing needed expertise, as well as collaborating and negotiating these dynamic spaces of learning. It also focuses on making connections between content and real life situations in order to solidify those links, those new understandings in learners. We want to be able to build on learners' prior knowledge, beliefs and experiences so that they are encouraged to be autonomous and proactive learners. We want to also create spaces where learners are asked to solve authentic and meaningful problems arising from real life solutions by relating these concepts to real life activities and events and processing and analyzing information. So knowledge is based more on activities and less on rote memorization. So we also want to concentrate the development on experiential learning and field placements, just like what we do with the field course in Montreal. We want to be able to get out of the classroom, be on the land, have that be an important piece of our learning, not simply a one-off field trip, but really have being on the land integrated into our learning experiences. We've had some challenges in terms of integrating, in terms of interfacing with the university. We're creating this program as a pilot, meaning that it's a closed cohort, and that provides us with a great deal of flexibility on a number of issues, which could have created barriers, such as admissions criteria. With this closed cohort, we will have time, it is my hope, to work out, because we plan that this is not just a pilot, but will continue each year as a permanent program. So having it be a closed cohort program in the beginning provides us with this flexibility. One of these key pieces is prior learning assessment recognition. And that was something that the health board, the Nunavik Health Board really emphasized, because it's a process that evaluates the knowledge, skills, and abilities a student has acquired through work, formal and non-formal education, and other experience. So it will be developed for each course in the BSW program, as applicants will most likely have some, if not a lot, of experience already working in social services. We will, again, use the prior learning assessment recognition to see how we can provide advanced standing credits to, again, use this prior knowledge to apply it directly to our 90 credit program. We're also doing a different delivery model in which we're having 1, 2, and 3 week intensive courses. So this allows for students who are still working to get a leave from work for a short term to be able to participate. And it also and at the same time as delivering the same number of hours that are required, and also creating block field placements rather than concurrent field placements during class. So we're also being very flexible in terms of our delivery model, something that we would not be able to do. Standard delivery models within the university are 13 weeks, 3 hours a week. So again, this flexibility takes into account students' needs to take time off of work, even though they may be still in Nunavik, but they might be in Kuujjuaq, which is the largest community of the 14, so they may be away from home for 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks at a time. It helps to address issues of childcare, and it's what we've learned with Indigenous Access McGill is this importance of individual mentoring and support. So it can also provide in case of academic struggles, we have these supports already set up. One of the imperatives was that this be delivered in Nunavik for many different reasons, as I noted. So students can go and learn at home, in their home environments. Particularly, there are issues with high-speed internet and other access issues to educational tools that make it very hard for remote programs and remote learning. So I wanted to share this figure, which was created by Professor Gabriel my colleague. And this figure captures what we hope will be the journey of students who who enroll in the Bachelor of Social Work. It's navigating the walk in two worlds of knowledge throughout the journey with support of mentors and instructors. So you can see that we hope that it is a holistic approach, that it will be a place that's oriented with the student. The student is in the center, and that's where our support will be. We recognize the importance of physical well-being. As you can see, the importance of land-based education, integrating cultural and language traditions, cultural knowledge keepers, as well as social well-being, being in the community, having access to Inuit and McGill instructors and mentors, particularly elders, Inuit instructors, having a program coordinator in Nunavik, as well as looking at community well-being. So this is contributing to well-being, engaging with community knowledge and practice. Community agencies will be our field placements, creating a student center. So a place where students can gather to provide peer support, and in which McGill is also involved. So it's extremely important for us to ground this and recognize, as Michael was saying, that there are multiple sources of knowledge, and it's combining Inuit and Western and First Nations Métis knowledge in this delivery of this program. So I'm running out of time, but I wanted to highlight that it's these principles that we plan on having as central to the curriculum. As Michael pointed out, these are not new. They're new old in terms of incorporating it into the BSW. Inuit Kuyimayi Tukangit has numerous principles. It's defined as traditional Inuit ways of knowing and learning. And so there are many different ways. For example, as you see in this picture here, having collaborative relationships and working together for a common practice, building positive spirit, being approachable, humble, hospitable, learning through observation and hands-on activities. These will be central and can be very different from learning in a classroom format. As I spoke about, we'll be tailoring the course delivery, having elders integrally involved, having check-ins, and being aware of the need and the imperative of different forms of expressing and relaying knowledge. Our curriculum will reflect Inuit and cultural realities, and it will be actually the first post-secondary program in Nunavik. And so it's exciting that it will be social work. So I wanted to return to the young student who is now a young woman. And as you see in this picture, it's, and I thank my colleague Pam Waitman for finding this picture. It's an excellent example of using education to promote strength, resilience in Indigenous students through education. And we have to be mindful at all times that this education is not replicating colonial structures, but decolonization is a continuing process, just like the anti-racism and anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism that we are currently facing. Well, it's been around for a long, long time, but it's coming to the forefront for non-Black and non-Indigenous and people of color communities. It's a continual process, and I'm thankful to be on this journey with my team. So this is a picture of Kangersujuak, where I was for one of my projects. And I'm very thankful that I'm going to be on this journey with my Inuit colleagues and my colleagues, Professor Gabriel, Professor Cecilia, and Pam Waitman. And I'm very thankful to have shared this with you.
Thank you very much, Professor ARIISW. Joseph, do we have a question before we move on? You're muted, I can't hear you.
Okay, I'm sorry. Actually, we have received 2 questions, but both questions are to Michael. There was a little delay in receiving those questions. It makes sense because we are thousands of miles away from you. So should we keep it for the final discussion, or? Yes.
Yes, how about if we wait for the final discussion and we can start with the questions for Michael?
Perfect, okay, okay.
All right, so I'm going to try to share my screen here. It's going to take me a minute to find this for some reason. Is this showing up all right, Joseph?
No, we cannot see your slideshow. We can see the present review. Oh.
Strange. Why is that coming up?
Still, we can see only the present review. Oh, yeah, there.
Is it there now?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So I would like to briefly share a little bit about what shapes my approach to this topic. Throughout my social work career, I had been committed to promote respect for spiritual diversity and help prepare social workers to respond to the diverse religious and non-religious backgrounds of their clients. On a personal level, I also have a very long-term respect for the Buddha Dharma, and in particular, I'm affiliated with the Quantum School of Zen, which was established by a Korean Zen master, Sung San, and that's an international school. So my approach to this topic is joining my commitments to spiritually sensitive professional social work practice and also respect for the Buddha Dharma. I'd like to start with the symbol of the lotus to highlight some of the key insights and values related to mindfulness and spiritually sensitive social work. So the lotus is a very symbol in Buddhism because it represents something very important about the human condition. Human beings exist in a situation of suffering related to sickness, old age, death, and the impermanence of phenomena. And so all humans are dealing with suffering in some way. Social work and Buddhism share a commitment to alleviate suffering. The lotus is a beautiful flower, but the plant grows out of muddy and murky water. And so that muddy, murky water is actually the fertilizing point for human spiritual growth and enlightenment. So it starts with authentic encounter with mortality, suffering, and injustice. As the lotus grows, it spreads its stems and leaves to the surface of the water and opens to the light, which represents realizing wisdom in daily living and realizing the difference between pain and suffering. In other words, pain is natural and even important. If we can't feel pain, that's actually dangerous because pain is an alert to be cautious, to withdraw from things that are harmful. Suffering involves the addition of attachments and confusions and complicated, distressing feelings. So then with this growth process of the lotus, a flower buds and opens. That represents resilience and growth and the opening of beauty out of this experience of suffering and spiritual growth. So social work can be a support for this process, both from micro to macro levels. And that can include, of course, both Buddhist and non-Buddhist forms of social work, and both Buddhist and professional social work commitments to support people's dealing with suffering and their spiritual development. So I'm going to focus on therapeutic mindfulness, and I'd like to explain what I mean by that. Therapeutic mindfulness is a wonderful method of helping. Within Buddhism, it supports the work of dissolving causes of suffering, such as inappropriate clinging, aversion, and ignorance of the true nature of reality. In professional Buddhist social work, mindfulness may be integrated into social services of various kinds. I want to note, though, that mindfulness philosophically has distinctive meanings in specific Buddhist traditions and practices that can be different from what social workers often refer to in terms of therapeutic mindfulness. In generic professional social work, we can use mindfulness to support clients' goals, reduce debilitating symptoms, for example, related to anxiety, depression, stress, and harmful thoughts and behaviors, and to promote well-being and justice. In spiritually sensitive social work practice, this can help open us up to optimal developmental potential and well-being of all. But there are some benefits and dangers of transferring mindfulness from Buddhist to therapeutic contexts. So why should we care about that? Well, from the standpoint of social work mission and ethics, we want to promote well-being and justice in culturally appropriate and humble manner. We want to counter discrimination and injustice, and we need vigilance regarding the history and current complicity of human service professionals in colonialist, hegemonic, and culturally inappropriate practices. Also, from the standpoint of Buddhism, the value of compassion, karuna in Sanskrit, is extended to all beings, human beings and all beings. So there are some benefits to apply therapeutic mindfulness to those ends of care, to relieve suffering and to promote well-being and justice, to both Buddhist and non-Buddhist clients and communities in a wide range of religious or non-religious, but spiritually sensitive applications. The dangers, though, are that we might misuse mindfulness practices through exploitive practice. For example, hegemonic, self-serving, and disrespectful misappropriation. We might also distort or contradict fundamental Buddhist principles when we transfer into therapeutic context. So I'm going to explain more about that. So more particularly, therapeutic mindfulness defined involves practices rooted in Buddhist meditation conducted by human service professionals, focusing on cultivation of mental qualities characterized by clear awareness of self and environment in the present, moment to moment, gentle, non-judgmental acceptance, opening a space in mind for choice-based responses, and liberation from detrimental habits and triggers of reactions. So we can use many exercises to promote these qualities, such as quiet sitting, meditative walking, breath awareness, awareness of the contents of consciousness without attachment to them, and body scan. Often therapeutic mindfulness practices are connected to evidence-based practices such as cognitive behavioral therapies, and they also can serve as a base for encouraging activism for social and environmental justice. So in Buddhist and non-religious professional settings, therapeutic mindfulness and related meditative practices can be applied in specifically Buddhist contexts, such as temple-based programs, Buddhist-sponsored social service agencies, Buddhist hospice and end-of-life care settings, Buddhist chaplaincy, socially engaged Buddhism. In non-religious therapeutic settings that serve a wide variety of people, this can allow for a widening of benefits to everyone in spiritually sensitive but non-religious approach, open to the diversity of clients' beliefs and goals, such as in schools, mental health centers, medical settings, hospice, substance abuse treatment, etc. And that's what I'm focusing on now, this latter use of therapeutic mindfulness in non-religious settings. Well, therapeutic mindfulness has become very popular in the human services because there's been an increase of interest in holistic and integrative body, mind, spirit, world approaches, spiritually sensitive practice that respects diverse religious and non-religious perspectives, connection to popular evidence-based therapies such as cognitive behavioral therapies and stress management, and widespread popularity in the general public. So I would like to suggest to how we might respond to some cautions with careful responses. And I wanted to thank Dr. Michael Yellowbird for our collaborations that helped to generate these suggestions. We developed some guidelines originally out of the context of responding to misappropriation of indigenous traditions and spirituality by some social workers. So my suggestions, though, they're not rules or a checklist of requirements. They're meant to be humble for critical, careful thinking, doing, and relating. Here's a couple examples of concerning activities, some examples of things we need to be cautious about. For one is to focus on symptom reduction in order to reduce reactivity to harm and injustice, which could be good, but if we do it in a way that promotes conformity and non-resistance to dangers, discrimination, and oppression on interpersonal and structural levels, that's problematic. For example, the school social worker or counselor teaches a student to be mindful and not act out or be disruptive, but ignores the student's living context of poverty, racism, and trauma. As another example, we might focus on training of awareness and concentration in order to heighten work productivity within an unhealthy work environment. For example, a human service organization might invite trainers to teach staff mindfulness to enhance work performance, but not attend to stressors of excessive stressful workloads or to legitimate staff complaints about organizational policies and behaviors. So we really need to attentive to supporting culturally appropriate practice. And here are some suggestions for that. If we're not actually using a Buddhist-based mindfulness therapeutic practice, we might consider naming it something different from Buddhist mindfulness or mindfulness. For example, awareness training or stress management exercise or therapeutic mindfulness. If you are using mindfulness as a Buddhist-based practice, here are some suggestions to thoroughly immerse oneself in Buddhist philosophy, traditions, and practices, to obtain permission, encouragement, and guidance from Buddhist teachers and friends, including for non-Buddhist applications of mindfulness, demonstrate respect of the tradition when presenting, training, and applying related practices. This could be implicit by maintaining congruence with Buddhist ideals, even though they are not stated. Might also be explicit by clearly acknowledging Buddhist and Buddhism-inspired sources. Also, we can collaboratively engage with Buddhist temples, Buddhist human service programs, and other formal and informal Buddhist support systems. And finally, we need to get clear about what is gained and lost by cross-tradition transfer of practices and be honest about what we're doing. Some more suggestions. If we adapt, we can adapt without distorting. This is similar to the ideal in Mahayana Buddhism of the 1,000 eyes and hands bodhisattva of compassion. That means to perceive need, to have empathic response, and to use skillful means, or upaya in Sanskrit, in order to help. So we can promote therapeutic mindfulness within the context of helping clients to cultivate well-being holistically, insofar as it fits their goals. This is similar to right mindfulness within the whole context of the Noble Eightfold Path, which is a commitment to cultivating a morally attuned lifestyle encompassing correct perception, conduct, and meditation. We also need to avoid promotion of unhealthy egotism and self-preoccupation while we're promoting personal growth, problem solving, and symptom relief. This is related to the concepts of interdependent co-arising and interbeing, which is a wonderful term that has been promoted by the Buddhist monk teacher Thich Nhat Hanh. Further, to support ethically and spiritually congruent practice, while promoting individual and micro-social system well-being, we should also promote well-being and justice for all people and all beings. This is related to the concepts of compassion and nonviolence. We can be highlighting the contemporary movement of socially engaged Buddhism and social work applications of healing justice. We can refrain from self-aggrandizing professional behavior and commercialized exploited profiteering in the marketing of mindfulness practices. This is related to the concept of right livelihood in the Eightfold Path. So I'd like to summarize some distinctions between appropriate therapy of mindfulness and distortions of mindfulness or unmindfulness. Mindfulness involves acceptance of the present moment. Unmindfulness involves acquiescence to harm and injustice. Mindfulness involves non-judgmentalism. Unmindfulness involves uncritical mindedness, like ignoring the need for clinical assessment of harm and critique of injustice. Mindfulness involves compassion and nonviolence. Unmindfulness might involve passivity or complicity with harm and injustice. Mindfulness involves empathy. Unmindfulness may include enmeshment or lack of boundaries. Mindfulness should promote relief of symptoms of stress, pain, and discomfort. In contrast, unmindfulness can dull the perception of acuity, dull perceptual acuity, insight, or the awareness of the causes of problems. Mindfulness involves the promotion of maximum potential, including spiritual development, as relevant to the client's goals and beliefs, and congruent with compassion for all beings. Unmindfulness can involve promotion of egocentrism and pleasant feelings to the detriment of personal development and social ecological welfare. So unmindfulness really involves subtle or subtle distortion of the genuine purposes of mindfulness. So I would like to thank you and conclude with this quote from Thich Nhat Hanh. With mindfulness, we consider the act of each step we take as an infinite wonder, and a joy will open our hearts like a flower. So let's see. So that concludes my presentation, and we have a few minutes for questions if there are any. Joseph, are there any questions for me?
Yes, we got some questions from the audience. Wait a minute, I'll put it on a screen. Okay, so now I hope you can see the first question. The first question goes to Michael.
Okay.
Neuroscience gives evidence as how indigenous rituals, practices, habits, rites of passage, etc. are fundamental to collective and individual healing. Should these be protected against commercialization, objectification, and cultural misappropriation?
Yeah, so I think, yeah, that's a good question. It's a question that's come up quite a bit. I think Professor Kanda was just talking about that, how he and I worked on an article some years ago about this kind of thing. I think mindfulness has kind of run up against the same thing, where it's been commercialized, and of course the objectification and misappropriation has happened with yoga too as well. So it's really, there's really a lot of, a lot of stuff behind this. I think some cultures are okay with, allowing people to use some of their, cultural rituals and that sort of thing. But it's really kind of a very tricky thing, because sometimes some leader in the tribe, whether it's from the Amazon rainforest or from Nunavut in the Arctic Circle, or from the Samis, or from, it could be someone in Australia, could share something with an anthropologist or a person or whatever, and say, well, this is my right. I got this, the right to do this. And a family or a community will say, well, no, he or she doesn't have that right, because this is not an individual thing. It belongs to the whole group, the whole village, or the tribe. So I think it's really a tricky thing. But yes, I do think they should be protected from commercialization and so on, objectification and misappropriation. Of course, yeah, I think it's, like I said, it's a slippery slope, but I think that's kind of what most Indigenous people would really like to see happen.
Okay, thank you very much. And also the second question goes to, oops, I'm sorry, goes to Michael. Please. Have you found or had a chance to look at the risk factors that reduce stress or trauma beside factors of colonizing? However, the way you described effects of colonization at molecular level makes sense. Okay, so what about other risk factors?
Yeah, of course, I try to cover as much as I could. I didn't get a chance to get into the genetics, because that's a much longer conversation. But yes, I've looked at a number of risk factors. One of the things that evolutionary biologists use, the term they use is mismatch theory. And for many of us that are closer to our indigenous roots, and what I mean by that, closer to the things that our ancestors used to do, sometimes we end up with different genetic variants that can really influence, our vulnerability or strengthen us against stress and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of research going on around that right now, especially with children and sensitivity levels. There's a phenomenon called orchid children versus dandelion kids. And it's, I think it's an NC3L gene that is related to sensitivity. And we know that in all cultures, there's highly sensitive individuals that make them more vulnerable to stress and to anxiety and depression disorders. When you think about it with Indigenous people, for instance, why would there be more? And orchid is a very delicate flower. And that's where they say the kids who are orchid kids are very delicate, sensitive kids. And probably a much greater risk of depression and maybe suicide and those kinds of things. The dandelion kids are like dandelions. You know, you can napalm them and burn them down and whatever, and they come back again next year. So we see that kind of thing where kids have gone through residential school, for instance. You know, my mother was in boarding school. I went to boarding school, and so on. And some people say, oh, you know, it really affected me. You know, I was raped and I was tortured and those kinds of things. And you know, of course, it's a very traumatic experience. But then another person, the same experience, said, yeah, that was difficult. It was very hard. And then we used to say, well, that person's in denial about their trauma. But now we know better. We know that it's probably they have other factors that, you know, like genetic factors that made them more resilient to this kind of trauma. So if folks are interested, again, you know, look that up. That's really kind of an interesting emerging research about orchid and dandelion kids. And now they've even thrown tulip kids in there, which I am, because I've got this particular gene that I have a variant from my mom, which she's the kind of like the dandelion mom, and my dad is kind of like an orchid dad, at least half of them. So I got one gene from him. So kind of, you know, kind of a, you know, in between. But yeah, so there are those kind of genetic factors too that are very important. There are others besides the socio-demographic that I'm interested in terms of the biology, but I won't speak of that because we'll get into another lecture here. So.
Okay, thank you very much. And we just received another additional question to Michael. Is the shortening of telomeres reversible through changing lifestyle habits or resorting to previous practices?
For most people, it is. Absolutely. Absolutely, it is. You could be like me, kind of have the genetic lottery where I inherited a number of shorter telomeres from my mother because of her experience. But I've got my test, but I haven't taken my telomeres advanced ancestry, so to kind of see, you know, whether or not, you know, mine were short like my mother's were. My mother's 94, so there's something else going on. So with her, but yeah, so the telomeres can lengthen. It's one of the slides that I had. Sorry I didn't get to spend much time on there. Things like I said, running, exercising, playing, laughing, hanging out with people that are positive, thinking positive, sleeping well, sitting in hot sauna 4 times a week at 180 degrees for 20 minutes. All those things are going to increase your telomere length. So again, just I didn't put it down here, but a good reference is to look at Elizabeth Blackburn's work. Elizabeth Blackburn, she is a Nobel Prize winner in telomere research. So she's highly accessible too, so.
Okay, thank you. And also the next question is for Michael. It's from Indonesia. In Indonesia, there is a culture in East Nusa Tenggara where the people in the village has this culture as coping mechanism where they will hold hands and make a circle while dancing and singing. This is only one of many similar indigenous traditions in Indonesia, but unfortunately, there has been no scientific research about how these traditions affect in human bodies, as how it has was said could reduce stress level, depression, etc. These indigenous traditions cultures could be potential as a field for indigenous social work research. How do you think we can adopt these traditions and cultures to be applied scientifically in daily life? Greetings from Social Work Sketch in Indonesia.
Yeah, very good question. I just want to caution people to, you know, to maybe not think of it so much as Western scientific research on someone's traditions, right? So if you kind of do this, this community-based, you know, participatory research with someone from the community, I think that's very important, first of all. But you're onto it, right? You're right on, because research does show us, and I've dealt really deeply into the dance research right now and movement research. Really some incredible stuff there. How dance, you know, can heal things like dystonia, you know, and different brain diseases and disorders. It's very powerful. So these folks are, you know, circling, dancing, and singing, which all, you know, combined together are raising endocannabinoids, probably repairing telomeres, keeping them long, keeping them healthy, and they're in their own tribe, the people. Those things are all in the research already. And of course, it could be, like you say, it could be not only for research, but it could be a way of helping people validate that their ceremonies are working and that they should use them. They shouldn't allow them to be kind of led off astray by Western sort of approaches and that sort of thing. And they can be applied scientifically in daily life because, this particular study I talked about showed that people who rode a bike so many minutes a day or sang so much a day or sang these positive songs a day, for this length of time had these different rises in these really important neurochemicals in the body, which then if someone did another sort of cross comparison there to see that, well, the chemistry is going up, the telomeres are growing at the end of the chromosomes. And wow, it's not surprising these people are living, they've got a lot of centenarians in their population. They're happy people. I mean, that's really what Indigenous traditions are all about, is that people are connected to them. So I'll say that much.
Thank you very much, Michael. And I would like to move to the next question, which is for Nicole. What kind of criticism or opposition against your initiative from established social work community and academics to start the Indigenous social work 10 years ago? Actually, you've mentioned some criticism in your presentation. Could you share more details?
Sure. We got significant pushback. We got it in different ways. I remember one meeting with a senior administration official in the university who was concerned about the students, McGill students being in Ganawage on Mohawk land. What if something were to happen? Presumably from community members. And so this was very interesting, because what actually in the second year of the program, the week that we have camping, the first night we were there, and this is May, but it's also Montreal, and we're right on the St. Lawrence River, there was a terrible storm and it was pouring and the temperature dropped to below freezing. And when we woke up, students' tents were flooded and we were freezing. I thought, all these students are going to get sick. We have to do something, but we didn't want to give up and go back to Montreal. And Courtney Montour, who's from Ganawage, who was the coordinator at the time, was putting a lot of, asking a lot of community members, like, can we go this place or that place? And the United Church of Ganawage opened their doors. They have a church hall. And they said, you can come in, you can sleep on the floor. There was one bathroom and a kitchen. And we stayed there. So, and we include actually having the United Church Hall each year in case of inclement weather. But I reflected on the fact that McGill senior official was concerned that community members would do something to the McGill students, when in actuality, it was the community that opened itself up to us when we were in trouble and we needed help. So that was one. We also, one of the activities that we have, one of the sessions is a session on beading. And beading was very important to Ginanongeha peoples, Mohawk peoples, for survival, also expression of their culture. And the session was designed to share that, while the students also do beading. This was also designed to get them out of their heads and do something while learning and sitting with each other and experiencing that community. This was called Arts and Crafts Time by some colleagues. And from an academic perspective, I was told, individually, that my time on this course would do nothing for my tenure dossier. And I did get tenure, and I'm still here. And so I think back and I think that those of us who started the course, we really felt strongly, and we felt that what we were doing was important and we were on a good path. And what we've seen is the appreciation of all the students who have been involved. And so, you know, we don't pay attention to the naysayers anymore.
Thank you. And another question for Nicole. Nunavik Bachelor of Social Work Student Support Program sounds very helpful for Indigenous students. I found even we can borrow this support program in working with and supporting our students who came from nomadic communities. This question is from Mongolia, from Professor Adel Bishai. I have a question related to recruitment or preparation of lecturers who can provide this program. First, do you recruit Indigenous lecturers or do you prepare Western professors to provide this program? And the second question is, how do you recruit and prepare local Indigenous volunteers of your student support program who could support students? Thank you.
This is another really good question. So as I mentioned, there are only 2 Inuit social workers. We plan, once we start recruiting, is to look to Nunavut and see if there are Inuit across Inuit Nunangat, the territories, including Nunatsiavut and Inuvialuit, as well as other Indigenous professors who would have an interest in working in Nunavut. This is not to say that Indigenous educators, knowledge holders are interchangeable at all. What we're trying to do is grow the number of Inuit who would be able to then teach in the program. What we will do, however, is that McGill offers a program. It's called it's in the Faculty of Education, and it's the Office of First Nations and Inuit Education. So they have teachers who have graduated from this program who are specifically looking at integrating culture into curriculum. And so it's my plan to, and we've contacted the Faculty of Education, this office at McGill, to see whether we can recruit their graduates and pair them with social workers, Indigenous and non-Indigenous social workers. So that's why there's always going to be a co-teaching model in order to prepare the program. But I mean, my dream is one day that it's Inuit who have graduated from our program who will then be teaching in the program. The second question, how do you recruit and prepare local Indigenous volunteers? So we're relying on the health board, the Nunavik Health Board, to spread the word, as well as the contacts that we have through our community partnerships. There won't be any volunteers in that the community members who participate in the program, including elders, will be paid faculty of this program. So paid members of this team. In terms, there may be non-Inuit and non-Indigenous professors who may come and teach if need be because of particular expertise. The health board requires that non-Inuit participate in a workshop that they run. It's about a week long to prepare non-Indigenous lecturers who come. So they have been doing that for a long time.
Thank you very much. And next, I would like to ask Edward to answer some questions. This may be a little off the topic. However, right now, there are so many Vietnamese technical workers in Japan suffering due to COVID-19 and mistreatment by companies that they work for. They have been helped by a Vietnamese Buddhist monk in Japan. can you make suggestions for Japanese social workers how to help and work with the Vietnamese community and the Buddhist monks?
Sure. So one of the key points I was making in my presentation is the importance of genuine partnership and collaboration, placing a priority on respect and groundedness in Buddhism in the case of therapeutic mindfulness. And actually in the 1980s, throughout most of the 80s, most of my practice experience and research in social work was with Southeast Asian refugees, many of whom were Vietnamese. So the context of that time in the United States is quite different from now in Japan, but I can tell a few stories about how we supported that work of collaborative connections with Vietnamese communities. So I found that it was extremely important that social workers and other helping professionals who are not themselves Vietnamese, that we engaged in very sincere connection with the Vietnamese mutual support systems and in particular Buddhist temples, which involved for me spending times visiting temples, becoming friends and learning from Buddhist monks and from lay leaders in the refugee communities, and establishing an ongoing long-term partnership, including multicultural teams that included formal collaborations of respect between the professional helping systems, including social work, health, mental health, etc., with community-based mutual support systems and temple-based support systems. Some of that was challenging because many of the professional social workers and helpers knew nothing about Southeast Asian cultures, or in particular Vietnamese culture, and many of them were even condescending or disrespectful about it. They privileged their own professional training and worldview and often ignored traditional healers and helpers in those communities. And sometimes even they created objections and hassles. Even sometimes there were racist and ethnocentric responses to the Vietnamese community and to temples. So one of the things that I did was set up mutual training experiences, like workshops that were set up to include members of Southeast Asian traditional healing perspectives, including monks and shamans and elders, along with Western style psychiatrists and social workers and nurses and physicians, so that people connected together as full collaborators. They presented together from their different points of view, and they educated audiences so that there was more of a sense of mutual understanding and an openness to genuine collaboration. Let me tell you one story in particular that related to a social work student of mine who was working with a group of, in this were Khmer youth, not Vietnamese. They had gone through extremely traumatic experiences in their home countries and difficult, stressful, dangerous refugee flight, cross-cultural transition stress in the United States. So they had a lot of trauma, they had a lot of struggles. And the social worker arranged a kind of group conversation, mutual support process for them. And they used storytelling, narrative, doing artwork to express themselves. And one of the things that came out of this as they were processing their experience was that they needed to develop a ritual to help them to process collectively what they were experiencing and help them shift into a more harmonious relationship with their current situation. So they connected with a Buddhist monk who worked with them to develop a Buddhist style healing and support ceremony. Some of that was traditional, but also the participants came up with the idea of planting a small tree in a beautiful area. So when they dug a hole for the tree, they also symbolically laid to rest their pains and trauma with a respectful approach to the earth, and planted the tree. And then the tree made new growth to symbolize the new life and growth that can come out of their new situation. In other words, a transformation process. So what I'm suggesting is that this kind of collaboration can draw on culture-specific and religious-specific approaches to helping and healing in collaboration, full respectful partnership with the professional social work services. But this takes a really strong commitment and a constant growth process on the part of the professional helpers in order to do that. It's not just some technique or some simple activity one carries on.
Thank you very much. And also the next question is for you, Edward. Thank you for sharing about using mindfulness from Buddhist and non-Buddhist approach. I think that it is important when working people from different faiths or religions. My question is, what are the ethical considerations when we try to get others, not from our own religion, to be mindful and to look at their spiritual needs within and beyond their religious understanding? Thank
you. I'll make a brief comment about that from the standpoint of professional social work. So spiritually sensitive social work is committed to promote respect and connection and collaboration across diverse religious and non-religious perspectives. So whatever we're doing, whether it's promoting, you might say, a secular therapeutic technique or something that's coming from a religious healing tradition, it needs to be grounded in the client's own goals, their worldview, their comfort level, their interest, their readiness, and also in the social workers' genuine preparedness to do that, and their authenticity and their permission to do that. So it really needs to apply social work ethics about honoring and respecting the priorities of the client and meeting them where they are at.
Thank you very much. Actually, there's another unanswered question. This question is for Michael. We got 3 minutes left, so I think we can manage it. So Michael, please, how would you go about teaching social workers about genetics or telomeres, and how do you think this would help them in their practice with clients?
I think, it's really important for us to think about social work really true in a whole, that it's not an observation of what's going forward, but we sometimes think about how things are going inside, like emotions, things that drive emotions, biologically as well as environmentally, that are connected to that. So it's really important, first of all, to kind of think that way. Second thing is, teaching, most students should have basic biology, and so you just sort of bring in the fundamentals of genetics, starting with, I like to think about what did indigenous people, what did people around the world know about genetics long before Western science start, studying genetics. And people knew a lot of things. I mean, they bred different species of plants together to come up with some kind of hybrid corn or with rice, or so that was going on for thousands of years. People certainly observed that with animals, that were breeding animals, where some were more hardy and resilient. So of course, people a long time ago, when they began domesticating animals, that's what they did. And even prior to that, our ancestors all over the world were observing the most healthy species that were there, that whether it was plants or wild animals, that had these genetic attributes, these physical, and mental attributes, that they would see. And then, of course, they saw that among themselves too. These were partly what arranged marriages were about power, were about wealth and those kinds of things, but they're also about, how well children would be when they were born. So starting, a decolonized view of genetics, I think, is very important. So that just didn't happen in Western. Then, of course, you can move into the Western sort of stuff, talking about Gregory Mendel and about his work with peas. I think it was sort of cross-breeding peas. But even before that, you had the Incas that were producing 5,000 different varieties of potatoes. It's amazing, what folks were doing long before Western science was doing this. So you get into that and then move into of course, then some of the Western stuff about that. But it's really important, and I think, to kind of get social work students then to find a safe provider, get their DNA tested, and to take a look at that. It really sort of hooks them in. So people start like, wow, I didn't know I had this genetic variant that, says I'm going to have, this disease or illness. Then they find out they never have the disease or illness. Why, Or then they find out that my father got this disease and illness when he was 50, when he started working, in the fossil fuel industry or something. What would happen? Well, that's called epigenetics, right? See, those kinds of common things can really sort of bring that, home to students. For example, when we talked about the land, why is it important to have clean water, clean land, clean air? Because, it affects us all, not just our health, but it affects us at these molecular levels and genetic levels. So it's to bring all this sort of real world stuff into it and connect those factors, and I mentioned together, so that students can kind of have an understanding of themselves and how genetics works. And of course, it's not, reductionist. It's not, that's not our fate, our genes. Some, they say as much as 90% of the environment, influences our genetic expression. And of course, it gives them another layer of knowledge to kind of look at. So I think that's why it's important for that. For me, I'm not a trained geneticist or a scientist. I was one of those people that bought, genetics for dummies, and genetics for idiots sort of stuff. I started reading that. And now I'm reading all the papers. And of course, I run it by my colleagues who are geneticists or who study, social genetics or, or whatever it is. And then I say, well, I'm thinking this way. Am I thinking okay, And so there's a lot of platforms. And I think that's a great idea. I wrote that down. Epigenetics for social workers, I think, would be a really great resource. So we'll write something. I'll get Nicole and Edward to help me out write something, and we'll make $1 million, right? Let's decolonize, make $1 million.
Okay, thank you. We received a message from Melinda. Thank you very much. Thank you, Nicole, Michael, Edward. You are all inspiring. Your personal generosity and professional commitment to the common good shines through. So it's very nice last comment. And 2 hours scheduled for our session are over. So I would like to return the microphone back to Edward. And I would like to ask you to close the session. Thank you very much for your question and for your cooperation.
Well, thank you very much, Joseph, and thank you, Nicole and Michael. It's been wonderful sharing this time with you and all the participants. Enjoyed their great questions, and I hope that we provided some inspiration for you all who are participating, and I want to express my appreciation for your own sincere commitments to promote well-being, social justice, and environmental justice, and to take into account Indigenous and Buddhist perspectives in a very respectful and creative way. So thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed and really appreciated your lectures and your session. And thank you all for joining us today. This is all from North America, but in 4 hours at 6 a.m. in the morning in the Tokyo time, 4 p.m. North American Montreal time, or in 11 p.m. in Johannesburg, Africa, the next session will start. The next session will be from Oceania, delivered you from Auckland, New Zealand. So if you have time and if you are interested in, please join us 4 hours later at our Oceania session. So thank you again. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.